Okay, welcome back to another episode of Author Interviews at Crystal Lake. And today, our guest is author David M. Salkin. And we're going to be talking about his book, Little Things Big. And I'm going to let him introduce himself now. So take it away.
Well, thank you for having me on. Little Things Big comes out April 17th. Only slightly terrifying. I think it's a book Michael Crichton would have written if he was still with us. He was one of my favorites and left us too soon. But think Jurassic Park idea, but with skin mites and giant cattle. I'll explain later.
Yeah, I agree with you, Michael Crichton. It left us way too soon. He was a brilliant writer. So give everyone a quick overview of the book. What can they expect?
So I don't want to give out too much and blow any surprises, but basically, Big Ag is going to feed the world and make billions in the process by supersizing animals. We're talking cattle that would normally be 1,500 pounds will be 15,000 pounds, the size of elephants, giant sheep, giant pigs. And they're also going to have the special feed required to grow these animals quickly and cost effectively. So they'll have the food part of it, and they'll have the animal product that they're going to be selling around the world to feed the world and make all this money. There's a fringe group that is sort of domestic terrorists who are anti-GMO, and they think they're doing the world a service by going after the company, not realizing that really they're being manipulated by the leaders of this group, who are basically going to short the stock and make millions on their own. This is just another crime for them. It's got nothing to do with anything altruistic. But the basically college age kids who are part of this group are just being manipulated, and they're going to go and protest and do what these groups do. And then we have the scientists in the lab who are the geniuses, who are actually trying to do something good for humanity, which is through gene splicing and genetic engineering, they're going to produce these giant animals. The earliest experiments started with skin mites. And why skin mites? Because they were easy to work on. They're tiny. You can only see them with an electron microscope. They're plentiful. They're on my eyelashes and your eyelashes right now. And just keep thinking about it. You're going to want to wash your hands when you're done talking about this. But we're covered in them. And when they're microscopic, they just eat, dense skin cells, and it's no big deal. When they're the size of large beetles, it might be a different story. So basically, it is a lab leak type of story. These things are released inadvertently by this group that attacks the lab when they're having a VIP party for senators and congressmen who have been invited out to write the legislation that will be required to allow these things into our food supply. And then it basically becomes a survival story while all these folks trapped in the lab.
Okay, so what were your inspirations for writing Little Things Big?
I think every story, and this is book number 17 for me, and I'm a thriller writer, but I write in several genres. I write military espionage, crime, horror, a little science fiction. And I think every story that I write comes out of something that I've read that I think is interesting. And it might be current events. It might be something I've seen while traveling. It could be just an article I've read, science magazine, it could be anything. But something that sparks the interest, and I just think it could be a good idea for a story. This particular case, I can remember being a little boy. I mean, way too young to be watching scary movies. And I went to see a movie called Food of the Gods. This is probably like in the early 70s. I was so little, and I think I had nightmares for weeks. So that similar premise about animals getting supersized and eating people. This book has nothing to do with that book, but I think the story was somewhere burned in my brain, and it just gave me the maybe some inspiration for writing an idea that would be along the same lines of things that would be on us and symbiotic in nature under normal circumstances, but their attitudes change when they decide they're the apex predator.
Okay, so this book has an ensemble cast, as you said. So tell us a little bit about some of the main characters.
Right. And that is something that I do in a lot of my books. Instead of having just a main character and you follow them through the entire story, I like to have sometimes a cast of characters. And part of that is because when I write, you are, as a reader, you're going to read the movie that I watched in my head. And so I'm watching this production in my head every single night when I'm thinking about this stuff for months at a time. And I think for me, it's more interesting to write that way when you get multiple viewpoints and you have more people involved instead of just one person telling you a story. This is more like the showing you a story because there's lots of things going on. And my stories tend to find a rhythm, like with three separate things that are happening, that 1, 2, 3 rhythm, until they all kind of collide somewhere in the middle of the story and you can see where things are going. So we have the corporate people. We have Connie and Paul, who are just all about the money and getting their project to the next level and getting it approved so that they can start making millions of dollars. We have the bad guys of the story, who are Wally and Dean, and hardened criminals, basically, who are influencing a bunch of young people to go attack this lab and destroy it. And then we have the scientists, Lamont White, who is a brilliant geneticist who has figured out a way to supersize these animals. And they run this gigantic, it's more than just a lab. They call it the zoo. It's out in rural Pennsylvania, hundreds of acres of this place where they grow their own crops. They grow giant animals. They have the lab out there. And so it's sort of isolated in this rural part of Pennsylvania. And that's where the story is taking place.
And of course, I'm sure that there's lots of conflict between the parties, and I'm sure some of them don't survive to the end. Good horror.
That is correct. And so Wally was a kid I went to college with, and Lamont's a kid I've known from kindergarten through high school. And I always use my friends' names. I do not ask for permission. They just end up in my books, which is why you should always be nice to authors. And some horrible things happen to some of these folks, and I apologize in advance, guys, but it's only because I love you. I put you in there.
Yeah, well, from what I hear, people like to be killed off in books.
I've had multiple friends volunteer to be horribly massacred as long as they can be in there somewhere. So.
Okay, so the book does deal with experimental genetic engineering. So why did you want to explore that specific scientific research gone horribly wrong?
Well, I think it's contemporary, right? I mean, we're every day in the news, we're talking about AI, and AI in and of itself could be its own category of things to talk about, but it's also going to help us take leaps in science. And so whether it's helping us with gene splicing, there was genetics that they started when they were making yogurt, which they now use to splice genetics in medicine and pharmaceuticals. And it's the wave of the future. But like, it started in one industry and ended up going totally somewhere else. And I think I find genetic engineering interesting. I think GMOs, although extremely controversial, there's definitely a place for it. I mean, there are some foods that exist in the world that without some genetic engineering would have gone extinct. I think papaya was one of them. And I remember when I was doing the research for this book, and there's so much to learn about it. I mean, there's cattle in the book, which meant I had to become an expert on cattle, which is why you were authors. You got 15 tabs open at all times on a million different subjects. And, if the FBI investigates me, they'll be like, this guy is a serial killer, but he's also interested in cattle. Like, I don't know. So some of it has to do with, line breeding. So you get the best traits of cattle to make, the bigger, better, beefier, or whatever. And then sometimes if they can't line breed animals, they will genetically modify them under the microscope. So, I mean, those things are interesting. I think whether you like it or don't like it is irrelevant. It's happening, and it's going to continue to happen. And I think as artificial intelligence takes us further and further into leaps of science, we can't even imagine what's out there. So I don't know. I write about what I think is interesting, and that is definitely topical to me.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is topical, and I think GMO, the ethics aside, because there's ethics in all these sciences, sure, but there are certain advantages to GMO. I mean, they can engineer crops to survive better in the desert, for instance.
Correct.
And to help, because with the climate change, you're getting more desert encroaching into places that weren't desert now. And so there are advantages, especially in the non-Western countries, I think. So, yeah.
Right. And the question is always, well, are there harmful side effects? You're ingesting something that's been manipulated. What's going to happen? Well, we don't know. We are all just one giant experiment. And I mean, the controversy of COVID, are you vaccinated? Are you unvaccinated? What did the vaccine do? What did the disease do? Was the disease created in the lab? You can go down that rabbit hole too and spend hours arguing with people. And no one really knows 100% where it started and what happened. And I was vaccinated twice because I had to be. I wanted to travel. And I think about it all the time. Like, I don't know what's in my body. Who knows? So we're all just a giant experiment.
Yeah, and most people don't realize our bodies are way better of getting rid of toxins and poisons and other things than most people realize.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we may have some things in our bodies that are not good for us, but a lot of it gets flushed away, so to
Yeah. Well,
speak.
you see,
So,
I'm sitting in my wine room, right?
mhm.
So is alcohol bad for you? Probably, but red wine is supposed to be really healthy. I like that story better. So that's the science I'm going with.
Yeah, it's like people drink coffee every single day. Caffeine is technically a drug.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's not all that harmful unless you drink like 3 pots of it a day,
Right.
but yeah. So, the book is also a bit of a creature feature. So why did you decide to go with mites as your creepy little monsters instead of something else?
So for me, when I write horror, I find it the most fun of all the genres because you're totally free to do anything, right? You make your own rules, you can create your own monsters. When I wrote Forever Hunger, it was a vampire story, but it was the vampire story I wanted to write because the vampire was terrifying. It wasn't one of these sparkly sexy people that, it wasn't like that. This was a monster. When I wrote Deep Black Sea, the creature down there, terrifying. So when I was trying to think of, like, this whole story and which of the animals, or what was I going to do that was going to be the monster for this story, skin mites, to me, I took entomology in college, and the only thing in my whole life that ever really freaked me out was parasites. Because, I mean, I eat sushi a lot. I probably have some in me right now. And when I think about skin mites on my eyelashes or on my skin, and we're all covered with them right now, and you don't even know that if they're there. But if you looked at yourself under an electron microscope and saw what was crawling around all over your body, it would probably freak you out. And if instead of fitting into a pore on your skin, it was large enough to run across the room and you could hear the little feet chittering across the floor, to me, that is so creepy. And I told you before, when I'm writing, I'm watching the movie in my head. And if I was going to create this as a movie, the soundtrack is what would give you the absolute chills. Because imagine the sound of a hard floor in an office, right? So it's like that kind of concrete sort of floor, and the sound of thousands of hard exoskeleton feet racing down the hallway together. It would sound like rain coming towards you. So if you could imagine standing there and hearing the sound of rain inside a building coming towards you and seeing just a black mass of thousands of things running at you. I mean, I get goosebumps thinking about it, just talking to you. It is disgusting. And to me, that's, you're trying to write a story that's going to make people have a visceral reaction. Like, that's what we want as writers. And I think it's effective.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of movies and a couple of TV shows where you've got that bug invasion thing, and that sound is definitely scary.
Right. And if you talk to most people, like, what are you afraid of? A common answer is like spiders. I mean, a lot of
Mm.
people are afraid of spiders. And these aren't spiders, but their body shape is similar, like mites and ticks and spiders, these multi-legged, ugly little things. And when they're teeny tiny, they're not that scary. But people give a huntsman spider or a tarantula a little bit more wider berth because of their size and what they look like. So imagine these things in the thousands. I mean, yeah, a little scary.
Okay, so you also play with some classic horror tropes in the book, monsters, genetically altered monsters, and a trapped group of people. So did you give these tropes any twists or subvert them anyway, or did you just play it straight?
I think for the most part, you play it straight. And again, going back to the idea of film a little bit, why do producers, directors, filmmakers, why do they use stereotypes and like people at a central casting? And part of that is to move the story along faster. Because as the watcher or the reader, when you see the bad guy and he looks like every other bad guy in every other movie, you know it's the bad guy, and so you can quickly understand where you're at, and we can keep going. I don't have to explain too much on this. So, and I don't mean that I use stereotype characters in my book, but what I mean is when you use tropes and some of these things that help the reader quickly identify good guys, bad guys, where am I at in the story? What kind of story is this? It just moves things along faster. And I think one of the things as thriller writers that we try to do is have an intense pace. I want my readers every chapter to say, oh, I just want to read one more chapter. And I want them to find themselves at midnight. They just finished the book that's way past bedtime, but they didn't want to stop. They want to know what happened. And that's, I think when you're writing a thriller style story, you want pace. And I think pacing is helped by some of the things that you'll find in general, whether it's a trope or stereotype or whatever. It's just like you're trying to keep things moving along without bogging the reader down in way too much detail. You don't need to know what color the curtains are in the room unless there's a reason for that.
Yeah, and classic tropes are classic for a reason. So yeah, because people love them.
Right, exactly. And sometimes people will specifically say, I want a story, whether it's horror or any other genre, I want this. And it's a specific thing, whether it's, the classic Odyssey type story, or if it's a survival story, or if it's a deep sea story, but they can go pretty down into specifics of what type of story they want. And now with like Amazon, you can go subgenre until you find exactly what you're looking for. And I think it's good. I think readers have so many options. It's nice when you can give them exactly what they want.
Yeah, this is especially prevalent in the romance genre. I know a few romance writers, and yeah, you can go way deep in the subgenres on that one.
You can probably pick the guy's hair color, right?
Probably. So, what's your favorite scene in the book without spoilers?
So, I mean, it would be tough, without spoiling things. I will tell you, and again, I probably should be in the movie business instead of the book business, but I see things as film. The original Jurassic Park, the very first time you go to the movie theater and you see the valley with the dinosaurs, and you just see these creatures that go on forever. And it was an epic sort of scene, like big cinematography. And I was like, so many years ago, but that very first one, we were all wowed by the special effects, obviously. But if you could forget that you were at the movies and just look at it, you were looking at this field of dinosaurs, and it seemed so real, right? So there's a scene in the book where you're looking at the zoo, these giant cattle and sheep and pigs, and these things are the size of elephants. And I saw that scene in my head. These are domestic, animals, and they're not dinosaurs. But I had the same sort of feeling as I was writing it. Just this, if you were watching it at the movies, to see to scale a cow or cattle the size of elephants. I thought that was pretty cool to me. And then there's a couple of the horrific scenes that I don't want to describe because I don't want to give anything away from the book. But definitely there's a couple of scenes there where if it was a movie, you would have nightmares for a while. You wouldn't be able to get the image out of your head. It's because even myself writing it, there was a couple of times I chuckled and just shook my head. Like, I can't believe the stuff that comes out of my head sometimes. One of my friends said, man, I don't know what you dream about, but I don't know how you sleep at night. I sleep very well because I get it all out during the day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird that horror writers can put all this out on paper, and it doesn't really bother us all that much.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to fantasy authors, and they struggle, and they're all emotional in their scenes, and I'm going, no, I don't do that. It's like, and then I've talked to other horror writers, and they're the same way. So it's like, there's definitely a difference with horror writers.
We get to play for sure.
Yeah. So, did you find anything challenging about writing the book? Did a scene or a character give you any trouble?
Not so much that as it was with anything that I write, I do want it to be believable. Even if it's a totally impossible monster story, I want it to be close enough to reality that it makes it scarier, right? If you think, well, this, I don't know, it sounds like it could work, So like anything else, there's always a ton of research that goes into any book that I write. And some research is harder than others. I have a story behind this one called The Travelers, which had to do with quantum physics and time travel and the multiverse. And that was a year of studying quantum physics. That was so hard and blew my head off. But for
Yeah,
this,
just listening to it made it
oh,
made
I mean, it was wild. But like for this, what did I have to learn about? I had to learn about line breeding of cattle. I had to go, under electron microscopes and look at pictures. Like that's the fun, right? And as an author, I think we need discipline to make sure that we don't get so into the research that we forget we're actually, there's a purpose to this. Like you're supposed to be working, so if you're writing your book, not just reading stuff that you think is cool. So, you go down the rabbit hole sometimes and you have to remind yourself, like, take some notes and go back to work. You're not here to learn about all this stuff for the next, 3 days. Just get what you need. So yeah, that's, I think every single book I've ever written has been sort of that discipline of learning what you need, but you're not getting a PhD in this subject, so just skim it and get back to work.
Yeah, it's definitely a trick to know when to stop with the research and get back to work. Because
Right, and so much, how many times have you written something where you do all of this research and 5 hours of your reading and taking notes and whatever, it ends up being 2 sentences in the entire book. It may have
yeah,
helped you write the book, but the audience has no idea how much time you spent just to get that
yeah,
one piece.
but yeah, especially with me because I write a lot of historical based stuff, so I need to get the feel of what it was like to live in the particular era I'm writing in. So I do have to do a lot of research, and I do lose myself quite a bit.
Right.
But I
And
mean,
it's fun, right? It's
yeah,
fun. It's part of what's enjoyable about being an author, but you got to come back.
yeah. Yeah, it only ends up being like a sentence or a paragraph or anything, but you still have to know whether a cupboard had drawers in 1856 or whatever.
Right. And that was actually, there was a group of us writers talking about, okay, what did you Google this week? Like, what was the funniest thing you had to Google? And everybody was just throwing out like one sentence of whatever it was, like like you just said, what kind of frying pan did they use in the 1700s? I mean, it could be something stupid, but
Yeah,
you needed to know because you were going to write a sentence in a book, and somebody was going to read it who knows more than you about that thing and is going to go, that's not how they did that, and call BS, right? So you try
yeah,
to
it's like
prevent that from happening.
yeah, I once spent an hour trying to figure out whether the Victorians had doorknobs or door handles. So turns out they had both because that was when it was transitioning from the door handle to the doorknob. So that was a fun hour to spend for no reason,
You're
and that's
never
the only
getting back. Yes.
thing. So, is there a facet of writing fiction that's tricky for you in general?
So, I mean, I touched on it earlier, which is whether I'm writing with a cast or just a couple of main characters, it is how much detail is enough that the reader understands what's in my head without slowing down the pace. Because a lot of times in my writing, I don't go into tremendous amounts of detail, and that's just a style. And some writers will describe every piece of furniture in a room, and I'm not writing architectural digest, so I'm not going to tell you about the furniture in the room unless you need to know that he's going to pick up this chair and hit somebody with it. So you need to know there's a chair in the room, so I'm going to tell you about it, right? But so a lot of times my writing, it's very fast, and I prefer to read that way as well. I don't. I mean, I'll give a shout out to Ken Follett, who's one of my favorites. Pillars of the Earth was one of my favorite books of all time. It was probably 1,100 pages. He goes into great detail, but he's so good at it that it was never boring. I learned a ton about building castles and cathedrals, and I loved every minute of it. But for the purposes of writing most thrillers, you don't need to go into such great detail. So for me, one of the things is always the balancing of giving you enough so that you understand this character is a real person and there's enough background and B story and whatever, but not too much that we're slowing down the pace. Cause I want you flying through the story as fast as you can, because you can't stop.
Yeah, that is the trick with thrillers because I mean, I don't write a lot of thrillers, but I do like reading them, and the faster paced, edge of your seat thrillers are the best ones to read. So yeah.
Right. And going back to filmmaking again, right? So it's like every chapter, not every chapter, but you try to have a little bit of the cliffhanger, right? So when the scene ends and the guy goes cut, you switch to something else, but the person viewing is like, wait, go. What happens? What happens? Well,
Exactly.
we're gonna go back.
Yeah, it's like you hate the author a little bit at that particular moment.
Yeah, the cliffhanger.
Mm. So, What's the hardest challenge you've had to overcome in your writing life?
The time it takes to write. I mean, I did write full time for about a year and a half, and it was the most joyful working part of my life. But most authors don't make a lot of money writing, so it was not enough for a family of four to survive on. I did it. I wrote 3 books in that time period, and it was great. I loved it. But ultimately, I had to go back and get a job. So when you have to work, it's hard to squeeze the time in among all the other things you do in your life. So it's just the discipline of sitting down and making yourself work. And I also tend to be a sprinter, not a long distance runner. So I'll be thinking about a story for months before I sit down and start writing. I might be researching and doing the mental exercises for a few months, so that by the time I do sit down and write, it just starts coming out really fast. And I can usually do most books somewhere between 3 and 6 months, but it might take me 8 months of research to be able to sit down and write it for 3 or 6 months. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So it's just time management.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem for all of us, I think.
Right.
Okay, so what's your favorite aspect of being a writer?
So I would love to think that I provide a mental vacation to overworked, stressed out folks who just need to escape. So if I can provide a book that's going to make you forget about whatever was bothering you and give you a little mental vacation for a couple of days of reading and have you get finished and go, oh man, that was cool. I feel so good. I mean, it's just like, I think any artist, and years ago I used to play drums, like to perform in front of an audience and see people's heads bopping while you were playing. I mean, it was joyful, right? So you're sharing, whether it's art or music or painting or writing a book or poetry, whatever it is. If you can connect with people in your art and have them get it, that is about as satisfying as I think as a human being as we can get, right? I don't know. And obviously, like every now and then, you're going to see a 2-star review and go, okay, that's not my audience, right? I'm not going to make everybody happy. But generally speaking, the reviews are what keeps me going, because there is an audience out there that loves what I do, and I'm writing for them. So if you've ever written a review for me, thank you very much. And this next one's for you too.
Yeah, I mean, even with the 2-star reviews, I find, I mean, at least they have read the book. I mean, sorry they didn't like it, but thanks for reading it.
There's a meme on the internet. It says, "You're the worst author I've ever heard of," and the guy says, "Yeah, but you've heard of me." So it's like, okay.
Yeah, so who are some of your favorite authors, and is there anything special on your to-read list this year?
Well, I mentioned Ken Follett. I actually met
Mm.
him at Thriller Fest years ago when I was on one of the panels, and super cool guy. What a talented author! Some of his work is my favorites. Rudyard Kipling was always a favorite of mine from the classics years and years ago. Just a brilliant guy. One of his quotes was, "A house can never have too many books, too much red wine, or too much ammunition." And I'm like, oh, this sounds like one of my friends. I think I can hang out with this guy. I do like, I was a huge fan of Nelson DeMille. He just left us about a year or so ago. And I will tell you that his son, Nelson DeMille's son, Alex, the two of them were writing a book called The Tin Men, which just came out last year. I just finished reading this a few months ago. And I had met Nelson DeMille at Thriller Fest also, and got a chance to listen to him talk, and just you'd want to hang out with him. Just a great guy, funny and witty. And his writing style, when Alex took over like the family business after the dad had passed, Alex finished Tin Men and wrote the story himself. And they're seamless. He writes just like his dad, same sense of humor. He's witty, he's great. And I was like, part of me was just very happy to know that Nelson's legacy will continue with his son, because his son writes just like him, and it was great. So I really like Nelson. And then Lee Child and Robert Crace, if you're into thrillers and you like those type of stories, those guys are awesome. Those are probably my favorites. I can keep going, but those are some of my favorites.
Yeah, I'm curious. Have you seen the Reacher show on Amazon?
The Reacher series?
Yeah.
Yes. So years ago, when the Reacher series was probably at its peak, it just started. I was at Thriller Fest in New York. I used to go every year, obviously. And Lee Child was the guest speaker, and he was talking about his books. He was being interviewed on stage. And this is a long time ago. At that time, he said, made the announcement. They're making the movie. They're going to make the first Reacher movie. And the interview was like, oh, that's awesome. Who's going to play Reacher? And he said, Tom Cruise. And you heard like 1,500 people in the audience go, no, because not that Tom Cruise isn't a great actor. He's great, but he's 5'7", 160 pounds, and Reacher is Reacher, right? So when they made this series, they got Alan Rickman, who is, I think that's his name. I might have got that wrong. But, he's like 6'6", 300 pounds. Like, he looks like Reacher in the book. And so it was a much better, casting of, I think for the readers who follow this series. I think we could all get behind that one. And again, is it the greatest acting? Yeah, maybe not, but it was enjoyable. And as a fan of all the stories, it was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. So tell us about some of the other books you've written.
So this is book number 17. So I wrote probably half of my stories were military espionage. My career started, the first book I ever wrote was called Hard Carbon. And it was a science fiction crime story that I wrote in about 2003. I'm a graduate gemologist by trade. I used to be in the jewelry business and the diamond business growing up. And so I was reading a book about diamond thin films. This was at the very, very beginning of synthetic diamonds. Nowadays, you walk into a jewelry store and they sell synthetic diamonds, lab-grown diamonds. This is before that. They were just experimenting. And so I remember thinking to myself, like, we went from vacuum tubes to silicon for computers. It was a huge leap. What if we go from silicon to synthetic diamond thin films? Because these are superconductors that aren't affected by heat. So in this story, the Russian mob is going to hack the web and do this international bank heist using these supercomputers. Now, I wrote this in 2002. This stuff hadn't happened yet. You didn't use Norton antivirus on your personal computer because there was no such thing as hacking and cracking and that kind of stuff. So I wrote it as a science fiction crime story. It didn't get published. I had an agent at the time, a beautiful woman. Her name was Barbara Bova. Her husband, Ben Bova, was like the father of modern science fiction. Ben Bova was a genius. So it was his wife. And when I used to call and Ben would answer the phone, it would be like, calling and having Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin answer the phone. I was so starstruck. It was so cool to be able to talk to those guys. They were the coolest. And unfortunately, right when we had finished the book and we did a lot of editing, Barbara and I back and forth, she passed away suddenly. So the book sat. Nothing ever came of it. And but I realized at that point I could write a book. So I went on to my next one. And this was right after 9/11. At the time, I was the mayor of Freehold Township, New Jersey. I served on the governing body there for 25 years. And 9/11 was very personal to me. I was 60 miles from New York City. Some of our residents were killed that day. A lot of my friends went into the service and ended up going to Afghanistan. I mean, I worked with veterans for 30 years. It was just a lot to unpack. And I wrote a book called Crescent Fire, which was a counterterrorism story, which was basically me, I guess, getting it out of my system because I was so pissed after 9/11. And they bought it at Penguin. So I remember the day that Tom Colgan, who was the editor at Penguin, he called me. I was at work at the jewelry store. He said, "Hey, I want your book. Do you have a sequel?" And I didn't have anything, but I was so excited. Now you have to understand, Tom Colgan was the editor for Webb Griffin and Tom Clancy. So this was like a superstar calling me to tell me he wanted my book. I was, thank God we were on FaceTime because he would have seen me jumping up and down in my office. So I was like, well, I just started it. He's okay. Send me the outline, the first 30 pages, and we'll talk, a couple of weeks. So I hang up the phone. Now this is 2004 at this point, and I go, I need a story. So the story is Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and what would the United States and Israel do? Now, if you put the news on, you would think that I watched the news and wrote the story called Necessary Extremes, but I wrote Necessary Extremes a long time ago, and the pager explosions that we all saw were like one of the greatest espionage things of all time. If you read the books that I wrote with Penguin, there's a cell phone that was intentionally given to one of the terrorists, and he goes to answer the phone and blows his head off. And I was like, I invented that stuff, man. So those first two books, Crescent Fire and Necessary Extremes, that started me off with my career with Penguin. And then I wrote a book, the first book of the team series, which was about a baseball team that wasn't a baseball team. And I gave that to Penguin. And they said they loved it, but they didn't think it was believable. And I said, well, this is, just so you know, this is the only thing I've ever written that was based on a true story. I had a friend of mine who was nowadays you would say Navy SEAL, but back in those days they were frogmen. They were the UDTs in Vietnam. And he did 2 tours in Vietnam as a frogman, and then he got pulled and put on the Navy All-Star baseball team, and they toured around Southeast Asia, 15 warrant officers touring around. Except there was no Navy All-Star exhibition baseball team. They were CIA. And they would just put on their uniforms, they hop on a bus and go drive around, and 2 guys would peel off and get changed and kill somebody or steal something or blow something up, and then they get back on the bus together and they would leave. It was a cover story, and I thought it was brilliant. So Penguin turned it down because they didn't think it was believable. And then I ended up selling it to Post Hill Press, who ended up giving me 2 3-book contracts. So there was 6 books in the team series, and they did very well. And actually, I went to New York one time and sat down. We thought it was going to be film or series. And, you know, in the literary world, if somebody says, I want your book, it's as good as a handshake, you're done, right? In Hollywood, when someone says, oh, I love this, we're going to make a movie, they're all full of crap. So this went on for weeks and weeks and lots of meetings. And I thought I was going to be a rock star, and nothing ever happened. So if you're watching and you're in Hollywood, please make me a movie, will you? So that was the team series. And then from there, I'd done a bunch of military espionage. That was like 8 books of that. And I was getting kind of burnt out from writing the same military espionage kind of stuff. So that's when I switched over and wrote Deep Black Sea, which was I'm a diver, and it's an underwater horror story. One of my personal favorites because I think it's super creepy. And there was a follow-up to that. So, and then I've written a vampire story in horror. There was the last book that I wrote before this one was called Blood from a Stone, which was a crime story. And it's probably the closest thing I ever wrote to myself in a book. It was, the main character is a chef, wine aficionado, and a wise ass. And he's like, hey, that's Dave. Except if I was a badass. So the guy's a badass in the story. And that was, I think, one of my better books. So, there's always something going on. I've got a science fiction following this one, and I wrote historic fiction that I'm still tinkering with, but I stay busy.
So what is your next project?
So the Travelers is pretty much finished. I think it needs another go around of editing maybe, but that was the one that was like almost a year of quantum physics and multiverse theory. And so the premise of the book is this, and I'm hoping Crystal Lake Publishing is going to take this book. Joe, if you're watching this, I want you to read this book. We wanted to travel to deep space, but if a planet is 20 million light years away, even if we could travel at the speed of light, which we can't, it would still take 20 million years to get there. So no one's ever going to get there. It's impossible. But what if you didn't need your body? What if you could release your consciousness into the universe, and your consciousness can travel faster than the speed of light, and you could observe deep space and travel that way while your body is kept on machines pumping your blood and keeping your heart going and your brain functioning, but your soul has left. So you can travel into deep space, and that's DARPA, which is where all the stealth fighters and all of our technology in the military comes from. DARPA is working on this machinery to allow people to travel without their bodies. And the premise of the experiment was that it was all about deep space travel. But as you start reading about quantum physics and the multiverse and these type of theories, you realize that when you can travel in deep space faster than the speed of light, you can also travel through time. And time doesn't mean the same things in the quantum universe as it does here. So these travelers who sign up to be, quote, astronauts, or they call them travelers, they start tinkering with their past because it's too seductive. They can literally see their entire life behind them and step back into it. And when they step back into it, they're stepping back into their physical being from their non-physical being. So it was a fun story to write. It was by far the hardest thing I had to write, because when you start doing anything with time travel, you really have to pay attention while you're writing. And you get interrupted when you're writing. You don't write for a week and you come back and you got to think, oh my God, what was it? Because it gets complicated really fast. You touch something here, you're affecting something over here. And that's why time travel should never be messed with. But I think it's one of my better stories. I'm excited about that one. I just got to sell it.
Yeah, that's also why I will never never write a time travel story. Love reading them, love
There's
watching all the time travel TV shows and stuff, but no, I'm never touching anything like that. It's
and
way too
you mentioned
complicated.
you write historic fiction.
Yeah,
So my last trip to Italy, I had a tour guide, and we were just chatting, and we were looking at Rome, and he was saying, you have these movies that are so popular about post-apocalyptic society. He said, but think about Rome in the year, um, you know 500 or something like that. It was at its height, and then I actually got my times screwed up because I haven't thought about this book in a while. I apologize. So it was maybe Rome fell around 435, I think,
yeah,
something like
that sounds about right. Yeah, because I know they pulled out of Britain 410, so
that.
and
Okay,
it was not long after that that the western part of the empire fell.
right, the Western Roman Empire. So by year 900, it's a city that was 1.5 million people is now 25,000 people. So Rome, the city of Rome, is a ghost town, and you've got just people living wherever they want to live because there's nobody there. So if you can find a palace that nobody's using, that's now your house. So we were just talking about this idea of a post-apocalyptic Rome and the people that would have been living in the dark ages at that time and what life was like. And so a good mental exercise, something I had never written about before, but having been such a fan of Pillars of the Earth, I was like, if I loved reading it, maybe I would love writing it. And I've been to Italy multiple times. I love to travel. So that was around the same time I was working on The Traveler. I was working on that story. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, Italian politics are and history is very interesting. I'm currently working on a 15th century uh fantasy fantasy set in Renaissance Venice, which involves a lot of research
Right.
because
Right.
yeah, I have to recreate the city because my character's roaming around the city for like good chunk of the book. So
It's a good excuse to go there, though. You can say, no, no, I'm working. I'm working.
yeah, but I mean, it's interesting to see what the history of it was to what the president is, and it's totally different. And some of the landmarks weren't even there in the 15th century. So
Right, right. When I was working on my story, the St. Peter's, the giant cathedral in Rome, this is, hundreds of years before that was built.
yeah,
So yeah, totally different. It was a swamp, right? I mean, looked totally different.
yeah. Okay, so I think we'll wrap the episode up here, and thank you for being a guest. It was a great pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to my next go around with you.
Okay, and that's it for now, everybody, and bye for now.